Yes, indeed. The dark sign brands the undead. And in this land, the undead are corralled and led to the north. Where they are locked away to await the end of the world. This is your fate.
So this isn't really going to be a review, but rather a chamber of thoughts and feelings that encapsulate my journey with Dark Souls. We all have that one important game, or something that became a catalyst for change in our perspective towards something. For me, Dark Souls was that catalyst. For so many things that I'll have to break down to the best of my ability, I'll have to, ramble on a little bit. When I was a kid, I was a fan of the Halo games, of Doom and Need for Speed. The first two were my gateway to shooters, and the latter was the sole reason why racing games were my favourite as a kid. But Dark Souls was an experience that made me think about so many other concepts in gaming that I never really thought of when I was younger. What was lore, and how does it impact the story and the world? Can a difficult game be fun? Have I truly seen everything the game has to offer? What am I doing wrong, or what could I be doing better? Some questions would seem obvious, but before all of that, I usually would just brute force my way through every game that I ever played, like trying to catch the chicken as it's running around you and you struggle with each attempt, but carry on anyways without thinking of any other solutions. It was that determination and willingness to not give up that allowed me to keep going. Dark Souls teaches those values, but in a multitude of ways where there's not necessarily a right or wrong in how you approach it, but a question of how long it'll take. It's a game that's been studied over, dissected, and experimented with in degrees I've never really seen in a lot of other games, at least in the way that Dark Souls does it. Dark Souls for me has been the most impactful experience I've ever had in a game. It changed my perspective in difficulty and what constitutes a challenge. It introduced me to the concept of lore, developing that insatiable interest to pick the world apart and understand it better. I never did that with any other game until Dark Souls. I remember picking up the game at a secondhand store called Couch Converters back in 2013, the original copy of it on the 360, back when I wasn't playing on PC that much. I knew very little about it other than it being a dark fantasy experience. All I knew was that it was difficult and it was challenging, but with satisfying combat to boot. The initial promise got me to pull the trigger and give the game a crack. I was shown a character creation menu, something that I was already familiar with in other RPGs. I had no idea about the significance of the starting items or the classes though, and I had no idea how big of a mistake I had just made with picking Depraved as my very first class. It wasn't like the classes didn't make sense to me, in fact it was quite clear. Each class represented a type of build or playstyle to go for. If miracles were the focus, then it made sense to go for the cleric, strength for knight, a mix for warrior, dex for wanderer or thief, sorcerer for intelligence. And I know I contradicted myself by saying that I didn't know the significance of the classes, but I didn't know the significance of the classes in terms of how they were implemented in Dark Souls, whereas in other RPGs it was a bit more cut and clear. But with Depraved being a clean slate, and when you don't know what you're doing, this, of course, is not the best choice to make. At any rate, I slowly made my way through the Undead Asylum, and was introduced in an excellent and brutal fashion of what the game was going to be like. Facing the demon with a broken weapon, uselessly fighting against it, where it felt impossible, only to realize that the door on the left was your way out. From that point, you would get your equipment, get a boulder, meet a dying knight and get a key, make your way through a fog gate, more enemies, another fog gate, only to find yourself back in the arena, with the larger-than-life creature reinforcing the oppression of the crumbling facility that you found yourself in, only to do some big damage. Suddenly, the fight feels possible, and you're no longer doing shit damage. And even if you died, you can backtrack and repeat the action once more. But say if you succeed and the demon is finally down. What do you feel from that? Well, you feel good. Really good. You get your first injection of souls. Well, your first big injection of souls. The currency that will help you quite literally, and a key to your freedom, from this place at least. What you come to realize as the bird envelops you, spiriting you away from the lonely and depraved asylum, is that your journey has only just begun, and it starts in a bigger and meaner hellhole than you could ever imagine. It's like opening your jail cell door, exiting the prison gates, getting that glimpse of fresh air, only for you to realize that there is another prison building on the other side. That's what Dark Souls is like, a layer of hellholes, but beautifully connected in some of the best map design I've ever seen in a game. In the Undead Asylum, it's small enough to get familiar with in time, but here, in Firelink Shrine, the nexus of your journey, where do you go? What do you do now? Even the guy that you talk to is lost and has given up. Talking to him more though gives you some clues, but nothing too concrete to indicate a clear and cut path. There are still multiple paths to go to, and again it's hard to decide which one to go to first. You brave your first steps and, in your infinite wisdom, decide to go up against the skeletons nearing the catacombs. Naturally, you'll most likely die because of how much damage they do and how ineffective your weapon is against them. That word being the most common element in the Souls and Souls-like genre that we will talk about later. Dying, that is. Or, you make an even bigger mistake and go to the New Londo ruins, only to get destroyed by ghosts you can't even kill, until you discover the transient curse item that allows you to use your weapons against them, and even then you're still fucked. Good luck trying to get the key to the seal with ghosts phasing through walls that can and will attack you from above and below thick surfaces. You come back to Firelink frustrated and confused. Then you remember the other path directly ahead where you see the large structures. You face some soldiers and you actually manage to kill them all without too many issues. You then realize that this is where you should have been going all along. And it's not long until you stumble upon Undead Burg, the central piece for the dregs of humanity, abandoned and forgotten by ancient beings who cursed them a long time ago. A drake says hi and tells you that you're fucked. You make your way past the crossbowmen and the soldiers, and you see a fork. You see something on the ground. In the room you find yourself in, and it's a bonfire. The same bonfires that you found in the asylum and in Firelink Shrine. But you don't know what they represent beyond just being a checkpoint, which is what they are essentially. In fact, you can go through the game without paying too much attention to the story, but to do so would be a huge disservice to your experience, missing out on many crucial factors that make this game a masterpiece, factors that I wouldn't understand the first time around since I was still busy being lost. The enemies you become familiar with, you feel like you can do this all day. You then find another set of stairs as you progress through Undead Burg, or another that goes into an alleyway just next to the stairs that takes you to the next boss, only to find this really large knight waiting for you. You try and fight it, because, you think it's like any other enemy, but then when you start attacking it, it just seems like that you tickled it. It takes one swipe at you and your health is gone and that's it. You died. This Black Knight is the earliest reminder that there are some enemies that will be skill checks, or just simply reminders that you need to get stronger through leveling or weapon upgrading, which is where your stats and your materials come in. The starting classes again give you an idea of what characters to go for, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to commit to that pre-designated path. You can do whatever you want really, just don't do what I did on my first ever playthrough and pump a lot of points into resistance. I brute forced my character through the Undead Burg. I faced the Taurus demon the hard way only to discover that you can cheese it by climbing the ladder and jump attacking it. The grim reality of the Drake would come to leave a permanent reminder of what fire really does when you cross a bridge with it on the other side. Meeting Solaire, the progenitor of the Praise the Sun meme that still lingers on whether the sun rises, and finally, making the suicidal charge on the bridge to reach those stairs, only to discover a shortcut with the ladder towards my bonfire and also a path that takes you underneath the bridge, bypassing the Drake entirely. But in this current playthrough, as you're seeing, I do it the long and stupid way and fight the Drake head on without arrows, because I had pried the Uchigatana from the nearest merchant in the Undead Burg that I killed, knowing he would never come back. And that's a thing in the Souls games, when you kill an NPC, they don't return, in the current playthrough. After endlessly one-hitting the Drake as it came down, I was showered with souls and could finally pass the bridge freely. Did I have to do any of this at all though? No, and that is the beauty of this game. There really is no wrong path to go in Dark Souls, and you're not so much punished for going the wrong way, but more so for making mistakes through combat or platform failing. The world is your prison, but it's also your oyster where you can go almost anywhere you want, where the only thing stopping you at this point in the game is the yellow fog gates in some of the areas. The only place you can make sense of at this juncture is the Undead Burg itself and its many pathways that lead to different areas like the Depths, Undead Parish, back to Firelink Shrine, and the church that led me to my first roadblock in this game, the Gargoyles. In my first time playing it, I had a mishmash of different armor sets and a polearm weapon. I used whatever I had at the time and didn't know what was viable for enemies and bosses, I just winged it, and the Gargoyles would be the enemies that would make me reset the game because I was struggling with them so much. And since my character had gone so terribly wrong with the stats that I picked, ever since I decided to strengthen my resistance stats due to the fear of rat poison, I would eventually take a break and time would pass. But then I decided, why not do some research this time around? Get to learn a little bit more about the game and what I just experienced. And this was another thing that the game had taught me, that it was okay to look things up that you were stuck on, or finding a better strategy towards something in a game, or finding tips. Finding some crucial information and some, viable tips gave me hope, for a second chance in the game. In a game that showed a world devoid of it, being faced with two words that would frequently appear every time you screwed up, you died. And when you die in other games, you get other messages that are clearing to the point. But in the Souls games, it throws it at you so casually as if, death is meaningless, that your death meant nothing, because, you'll be back anyways. This screen, when you die, it becomes so ingrained in you throughout your entire experience, and you start to treat it like it's nothing, brushing it off as just text that's in the way of your screen, thinking more about the mistake that you just made, rather than just the text itself. It's a cycle, in a game about cycles where you die and you live again to correct your course to overcoming the obstacle or defeating the enemies and the bosses that laid before you, as well as continuing on in a journey that your character doesn't even understand, in a world that has lost all sense of time. And the only thing we have to operate on here are the places to visit, the bells to ring, a fortress to break into, and also the most memorable and iconic moment in the entire franchise. The Bells of Awakening become the main goals once it's brought up to you. The biggest challenge though is finding them. When I came back and faced the Gargoyles once more and finally defeated them, it was like defeating your own arch nemesis and finding a semblance of peace. But I would find more than that. I would find progress by way of ringing the first Bell of Awakening. Something different had happened this time, a change had been made in the land, and it's reflected upon in the Firelink Shrine when you talk to that crestfallen knight once again. The next question becomes, where is the second bell? And the answer is, it's nowhere in Undead Burg, but far below a place that reminded everyone of another filthy place in another game that came way before it. One that I would play much later on, Blighttown, the bane of my journey in this game. The place of toxic darts that delete your health in a terrifying manner, and a swamp that's hard to move in, unless you have the rusted iron ring. How do you get back to the asylum? Go to the elevator in Firelink Shrine that takes you back up to the church. jump off of it just before the path closes, make an incredibly annoying jump again onto this platform to get the west key, pray that you land this jump, ascend up the thin stairs, and then rest on the nest until a cutscene appears. This is something that is incredibly easy to miss out on because most people won't even know it's there to begin with. Most people in the beginning would never have thought to do something like this, but this realization also encapsulates just how much depth the world of Dark Souls has, where you're rewarded for taking the extra mile to discover new things, leading to huge surprises. And one of those surprises even leads to an entirely new world if you have the right item, which is found back in your jail cell in the asylum, which by the way is now occupied by Black Knights and torch-bearing shitheads. Oh, and that ground where you fought the asylum demon, a part of it crumbles and you get to fight another one, only that it's stronger and does more damage. The game is chock full of secrets that I still haven't discovered to this day. Dark Souls has one of the richest worlds out there still. The first half of the game is a masterclass in world design that is hard to replicate still. And this goes beyond just the secret rooms or the illusionary walls that you can hit, but also in just the observation of your areas. The centralized place of Londor is so well connected that it makes sense geographically. The majority of the areas themselves constantly remind you of their presence, even when you go into places like the Darkroot Forests, and you can see those places, the ones you've already been to, from a distance, but from a point of view that seems believable. And it's something that the sequel tries to do as well, but nowhere near as effectively, and 3 comes close, but not quite as good as what 1 accomplishes in its first half. As I progressed towards the second bell, I would start from the lower parts of Undead Burg and face one of the worst boss fights in this game, the Capra Demon, a boss of 2 dogs and a very small room. Mind you that it's optional and it is doable, and while it does encourage you to approach it with a different strategy, it's still a pretty small arena, probably too small for a boss arena. And its existence makes you want to destroy it completely, so naturally you'll kill it regardless. And with trial and error, you do. And speaking of the connectivity of Undead Burg and how well it's done, again, no matter where you go in Undead Burg, there is always a way back to Firelink Shrine, and from Firelink Shrine, there are multiple ways back to Undead Burg, and it's amazing. In the depths lie a few annoying enemies, most notably the Basilisk, where I stupidly allowed myself to get cursed for the first time. Also, these things up in the ceiling that drop down, rats with poison, and a large gaping dragon, where I was, when I first fought it, doing 37 damage per hit with the Jagged Ghost Blade. Remember Blighttown? Well, this is one way that you can get to it, and it's the worst way possible, and I would not wish this on anyone. The easiest route, though, is through the Valley of Drakes, which you can get to through New Londo with the Master Key, a starting item that helps in more ways than one, or by going through Darkroot Basin, going right at the first fork, going down the cliffs until you face a Black Knight, kill him, find a tunnel that leads to a bonfire, rest up and take the elevator down, and you'll reach the Valley of Drakes. The blue drakes themselves are pretty easy to deal with, but can be tanky at the beginning when you have a weapon that doesn't do much damage. But from this point on, go down and turn left. Follow the path and ignore the next drake. You'll come across a large undead dragon, but it isn't that bad unless you take a swipe attack. Cross the bridge and you'll see another large tunnel. This is the easiest path to Blighttown possible, and it's where you need to go to ring the second bell. With the help of guides and trial and error, I would finally reach a bonfire in Blighttown, and it felt like I did a marathon. I explored around, slowly and quite literally, through the swamp, and would discover an entirely optional area called the Ash Lake, and the pathway that also leads to the next main boss. This boss was intimidating at first, especially with the use of healing items, not having that many because of the poisoning effects, and using moss to clear it, on top of the lava and the considerable damage that I received during the fight, but I was relieved knowing that it wasn't another shitty gang fight like with the gargoyles. But again, I felt that great sense of victory once it was finally gone. I rang the second bell, I saw the gate at Sen's Fortress open, and at this point it becomes immediately clear what you have to do, and it's a place that you've already been to where you encountered an onion with a sword. When you've played this game enough times, you already know what to do. But when you're given a clue like this, it feels like you're actually getting somewhere, and it's like, I've seen that place before, and naturally, that's where you'll start going to next. You finally have a direction to aim for, rather than cryptic clues in places that you haven't made a connection with yet. Sen's Fortress, like an onion, is a layer of traps and boulders that knock you down on your feet, swinging pendulums that make you fall to your death, and serpents with swords and shields, lightning and sharp daggers. I spent more time in this place than I'd like to admit, but the fucking sigh of relief that I felt when I finally passed that last narrow bridge and discovered that bonfire below the edge outside is hard to describe. The hardest part here was finally over, and I could see a large golem in the distance. But due to the exploratory nature of the game, I looked around and found a giant throwing boulders, the culprit for the scorch marks on the ground. Eventually I killed him, and it made the next part significantly easier. The Iron Golem is your final destination in Undead Burg, the only thing stopping you from reaching the heavens in this game. All that time training and conquering the bosses below made you ready for this battle. You swing at it until it finally dies. Sen's Fortress was now your fortress, but your goals were bigger than that, and the place you go to next is unlike anything you've seen up until this point, and it's a moment that I'll never forget. Anor Londo, the city that kept the lowly humans away from its divinity, its larger-than-life structures and walkways that weren't made for you. This was it. You were in the big leagues now. The Undead Burg was a thing of the past, and you had a clear goal just from its definitive size, the capital that was at the epicenter of everything in Anor Londo. At this point, I wasn't as lost as I was before, because with all the trials and errors of the Undead Burg, the areas that I explored, the bosses I fought, had already conditioned me to its flow of gameplay and exploration. What made Undead Burg so intimidating at the beginning was the amount of pathways that it provided, the forks that led to new areas as well as the shortcuts. It was hard to tell where you were going the first time around. That's not really the case though in Anor Londo. It's pretty clear where you need to go. But the biggest challenge is getting to the capital itself. From the narrow bridges to the infamous arches that knock you off the archways as you ascend up and try and get inside the building. God forbid if you die though, because this is an area that requires a mix of luck and infinite patience. You have no idea how lucky I was in this playthrough that you're seeing now. This was on the first go, and lots of people struggle with this on multiple occasions, multiple times, because of how easy it is to get knocked off by the archers themselves. And if you die, then you have to march all the way back to that position, and it's a long walk. Anor Londo is grand in scale and size. It is a stark contrast to everything that you'd seen before. It's new and shiny and not decrepit and in ruins. Remember those Black Knights? You have silver ones, and they're not too difficult in comparison. But why am I saying this so confidently? Why am I brushing off the difficulty here? Well, it's mainly through memorization and experience. You see, Dark Souls is one of those games that, yes, it does get peddled on for being like a really hard game, but paradoxically, the more you play it, the easier it gets. and the experience that you attain is like a reflection of that reality. But for first time beginners, yes, the game is really, really hard. You'll reach a point where you get the flow of things, and knowing the challenges that lie ahead, you know that the game will get harder at different points, but at the same time, you've already gotten the gist of the game, and all that experience and memorization that you've gotten from bosses and enemies will eventually carry over to new enemies and bosses where you just repeat the process, thus making the game easier. And then when you look at the game retrospectively, you sort of think, hey, the game's actually not that hard. I mean, it's challenging, but it's not super hard like it was in the beginning. What actually led me to beating this game for the first time? What enabled me to do so? For a lot of people, it's a lot of different variables, but for me, it was one distinct weapon that had carried me from the moment I found it to the very end, and it was the Black Knight Halberd. I didn't get it in this current playthrough, but the Black Knights that carry it may or may not drop it. If you're unlucky, you miss it, but I didn't, and it was the reason I did it the first time. Afterwards, I was able to beat the game in succession, with different builds and playstyles. I know how the enemies work and how to handle them, even with this near maxed out Uchigatana that I obtained through upgrading. And like I had already said, the more you play this game, the easier it actually is, because of all the memorization that you force yourself to attain through fighting enemies and retrying bosses. And when you face new enemies and bosses, you're essentially repeating the same process, and that kind of just becomes the gist of not just this game, but pretty much every Souls-like and Souls game that comes afterwards. Anyway, so you make your way through the doors of Anor Londo once you're inside, finding suspicious chests, silver knights, and if you're very unlucky, player invasions. I forgot to mention something very important, and that is the multiplayer aspect, which is a thing in this game. But it's circumstantial. If you're hollow, which is your default status, you can't be invaded. But if you're invaded, then prepare to get steamrolled by a cheap magic user or some maxed out masochist that can parry you blindfolded. Then there's also the co-op aspect, which you can do in either PvP or assist another player during boss fights. Speaking of the invasions themselves, it can still technically happen even when you're offline and as a human, but they appear as NPCs rather than just humans, still making it worthwhile to stay human though because of the decent souls drops that you can get, and sometimes also item drops like weapons or armor sets. Anyway, sorry to get sidetracked there, but while I'm still rambling, I thought it would be important to at least bring up the PvP and the co-op, especially since it's going to happen at one point or another, whether you like it or not. Anyway, Ornstein and Smo. The infamous 2 boss fight that made the Gargoyles a hollow victory in comparison. It's arguably the most iconic fight in the game because it represents the halfway point of your journey and becomes the skill check that determines whether you have what it takes to beat the game or not. But this wasn't like the Gargoyles. I wasn't going to give up. I was going to beat that spear-wielding scum and that fat slob. And after numerous tries the first time around, with the gold-hemmed black set and the Black Knight Halberd, I got the job done. I met the big titty princess and was given the Lord Vessel, which is a warping device that can immediately get me out of Anor Londo and back to the shrine. I was on fire at this point, and I'd beaten one of the game's hardest bosses and had conquered Anor Londo. The thrill of victory is something that is hard to replicate, but Dark Souls had always managed that fine line of making something difficult but also fun at the same time. And when you finally beat that difficult boss, it felt like a genuine achievement rather than a sigh of relief. Well, at least for most of the bosses in this game anyways. For me, Undead Burg was like that giant test to see how far I could go. Anor Londo was the mountain I got on top of, and afterwards came the cleaning up period that makes up the second half of the game. When you get the Lord Vessel, you go back to Firelink Shrine and you can talk to that serpent, who will then teleport you to a different area where you can place the Lord Vessel. At this point, the yellow fog gates disappear, which would give you the chance to now finally go deeper into the other main areas like the Duke's Archives, the Catacombs that lead to the Tomb of the Giants, the Demon Ruins that lead to Lost Izalith. And as for New Londo, it's actually the exception out of the bunch because long before even getting the Lord Vessel, you can actually clear the whole area. But because of how difficult it is, it's ill-advised to do so. The guy that gives you the key to the seal after getting the Lord Vessel well, you can actually kill him and get it anyway before having the Lord Vessel. You open the floodgates, go down and fight the Dark Wraiths that can suck your soul, progress until you find the fog gate that leads you to a set of stairs, and, well, when you reach nothingness, you reach the abyss and then you die. Oh, sorry, yeah. I got really carried away here explaining this, because I forgot one particular element that's also part of a very iconic and memorable moment, and that is meeting Sif, the big giant wolf that carries a sword. And how do you get to Sif? Well, you go to either Undead Berg, back to the tower where you go to the Taurus Demon, but instead of going up, you go down through that door that leads down to the basement, take the door, fight and kill Havel the Rock, open the door. Now you're back at Darkroot Basin, where there's golems and a large hydra, climb the large ladder, go through a forest full of hostile NPCs, and is also a hotspot for PvP invasions. Talk to the cat, join the Covenant so you don't get attacked again, go past it, reach the fog gate, reach the graveyard, and then you can fight Sif. And also, by the way, did you know that you can save up 20,000 souls and buy the Crest of Artorias? That also opens that gate that you couldn't open. Oh, and if you hit the wall on the left, there's a bonfire. Anyways, back to New Londo, take the shortcut down to the lower floor area, the fog gate, down into the abyss, and fight these dickheads. How do you like infinite spawning enemies that hit like a truck from a distance, can throw homing magic spells at you, and can also grab you without much warning? If you have your strongest weapon, now is the time to use it. If you have decent armor, you can take minimal damage up close, but the priority here is mainly to kill the immediate Lord as quick as possible before others start spawning. This is one of the Great Lord bosses that you have to fight in order to fill the Lord Vessel that you use to open the gate to the final area, but most people didn't know at the time that you can fight the Four Kings prematurely before even reaching Analondo. But again, I recommend fighting them afterwards because you'll be fairly high leveled for it by the time you reach that point. But people have done this at strength level 1 without getting hit, which is insane, but there's a lot of crazy shit that's happened since 2011, so it's not a big surprise nowadays when someone beats the Four Kings at, New Game Plus 7 with strength level 1, you know? That's just like Monday nowadays. As for the other main areas, well, there weren't that many surprises for me at this point since I was already familiar with the general areas due to exploring them prior. Navigation though was the only thing that I had to get familiar with further down the track. The Great Lord areas represent the second half of the game, or at least the main parts of the second half of the game, and it's where there is a shift in quality here. It's the most divisive part of the game, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but most people have the impression that it all felt rushed, especially in Lost Izalith, from copy and pasted enemies like the Kappa and Taurus demons, the reused bosses, Bed of Chaos being more of an exercise in frustration than a genuine challenge, the Tomb of the Giants being next to impossible to navigate without a source of light, while being surrounded by skeleton dogs, and the Duke's Archives, which I found to be the best of the bunch except for the Crystal Caves. That place can go fuck itself. The Catacombs itself was great, but the tombs weren't that great. From getting kicked from behind by someone who promised treasure, to skeleton dogs I actively avoided, and for good reason, to not having much to see to begin with besides being able to see Ash Lake and the Demon Ruins from a distance. The Nido design itself is really cool, but the boss is fairly easy. Just stay close, tank his wave blasts, smack the skeletons with a divine club, stay in the area you drop down, and don't go anywhere else until he's gone. Seif is a joke. The lore behind him though and the archives is interesting, but the fight itself is pretty underwhelming. And that's the word that kind of lingers on in the second half of the game. Underwhelming, and maybe that was the point, even in spite of the rushed status. You're up against essentially the Great Lords that are in reality a shadow of their former selves, who are still powerful, but are way past their prime. This point is compounded in the final boss as well, which you will see at the end. The majority of the game's bosses have that satisfying feeling, but some of these bosses had more of a feeling of relief that I was finally done with them and could move on with the rest of the game. Contextually, it makes sense for this underwhelming feeling to kick in because of the status of these characters and the state that they're in when you find them. I just wish that they were still challenging and satisfying in the same way as the earlier bosses. The Artorias of the Abyss DLC fixes this though. and with its bosses being some of the best, if not the best, in the entire game, starting with Artorias, a legendary knight who has become the very thing he fought against, a creature of the abyss. This DLC echoes that well-crafted feeling that the first half of the game had. Everything is not the same as it was, but is still in depth in its own right. The bosses aren't what they used to be, but they still provide a satisfying challenge that the Great Lords couldn't. Beating Artorias, Calamite, and Manus was satisfying. Bed of Chaos, Nito, and Sif were not. But I was still satisfied knowing that the end was near. My disbelief in how far I had gone in my journey. The secrets I'd found, the NPCs I talked to and discovered, finding Ash Lake, winning my first PvP fight in Anor Londo, discovering the painted world of Ariamis, was all through trial and error and discovery of the game, and its mechanics and its features, its lore and its universe, and not giving up when it seemed impossible at times. When I reached the final area of the game, filled with the Black Knights that destroyed me the first time around, only for the tables to turn, I knew that the end was near, reaching that final fog gate, and then having the most unexpected boss music hitting me. The final boss track was melancholy and sad, and not some big orchestral climactic battle that you would expect to see in a RPG game. You were faced with Gwyn, the person responsible for the state of affairs, the source of humanity's affliction, reduced to the same fate that has befallen everyone else, hollowed and empty. It's a tough fight until you realize that you can parry him, another one of the game's most useful abilities, and is a meme in itself. You strike the final blow, and you notice your heart is beating really fast. You reach the last bonfire, and your final realization kicks in.
My lord, bless thy safe return. Let Karth and Frout serve your highness. We are here to serve your highness. Let the true dark be cast upon the world. Our Lord returns.
You beat Dark Souls. It's another feeling that I will never forget. When I completed this game the first time around, I just watched the entire credits roll in. Dark Souls at that time in my life was the hardest game I'd ever played, and I beat it. It felt like I could do anything afterwards, and it would for a time be a game to think of whenever I would play other difficult and challenging games. Dark Souls for me at that time was that template, giving me the assurance that I needed to beat anything else or any other game. I would tell myself that if I could beat Dark Souls, then I can beat this. It's a dangerous but motivating mindset, but adversity is a strength that we all have, and if applied correctly, can do absolute wonders. Dark Souls is a game that has that in spades, where each successful step is a milestone, each discovery is a miracle, each triumph is an epilogue of its own story with a satisfying conclusion. There is so much about this game that I can talk about, but this video was just more about my thoughts and feelings in retrospect while playing through the game again for the first time in a while, and how I felt then and how I feel now. And now, I still think the game is a masterpiece in game design, in world building and map connectivity, as well as satisfying combat and gameplay flow. It still has some immensely satisfying moments that still ring true to this day, and a unique approach to its multiplayer system as well. Everything that has come since Dark Souls 1 has been a continuation of that same experience, but with different variables as seen in Dark Souls 2 and 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Bloodborne being my favourite From Software game overall, Sekiro being my favourite in terms of combat, and Elden Ring is close to being my favourite, but Bloodborne beats it by a close second. Dark Souls 1, though, is and always will be the most impactful game of the Souls universe. I still pop it in and feel some semblance of the magic that it still has. There's still lots to discover and things I haven't really shown due to not wanting to spoil more than I already have. It definitely has its flaws. The backtracking can be tedious sometimes, especially in the first half and when you've already gone through the game multiple times. Hitboxes can be a bit wonky, especially with the Bed of Chaos, the awful platforming, not being able to pause even while being offline, not being able to warp to every bonfire even after getting the Lord Vessel, where it enables you to go to some but not all of them. The second half feeling a bit weaker than the first half with some underwhelming boss fights. But those issues are overshadowed by how much the game gives you, not to mention the massive community through content creation, the modding scene and resources that can be found in Dark Souls 1. The game is highly replayable, always new things to discover, mods that shake the experience up to infinite degrees. PvP and co-op can be fun, and sometimes miserable, more so in PvP, but if you like dealing with magic users a lot, then yeah, there's definitely a lot of fun to be had in the PvP section. And the lore and the world building of this game is amazing. It may age, the flame may fade, with only dark remaining, but Dark Souls 1 will always be a masterpiece that's affected my perspective in gaming forever. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.